Welcome to another episode of The Golden Hour. I'm Rashad Bader, and I'm here with Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, Rashad, great to be here again. And thanks for joining us. You're filling in again for this week for Sharif.
Yeah, that's right. I'm grateful to have a second opportunity to be on the podcast. Kevin, I figured we could use this time to do a sort of back to the basics. We've had a lot of people reaching out about coaching, about the masterclass, about institutional engagements, and I just feel like this is a good opportunity for us to sort of revisit the purpose of optimal work, some of its component parts, and how people can best use what we've put together to help them achieve growth. How does that sound?
It sounds like a great idea.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and start with the first thing. Usually what I do when I meet with people for coaching or for training or anything of that nature is I always start with the purpose. So Kevin, how would you define the purpose of optimal work?
I think the purpose is to help people bring their highest ideals into each hour of work. And what we mean by that is getting people to change the very way that they work for the better. Thinking of what would be the best qualities I could have? What would it look like for me to really be thriving when I'm doing this task? Growing, challenging myself and not simply being challenged. But if you're going to challenge yourself, you need some image that's like of the noble, the beautiful, what Aristotle calls the kolan. You need this image. Aristotle actually says that to act well, before you act, you need an image of what the noble or beautiful would look like in that action. That's essentially what optimal work is doing, helping people shape what they do in advance. Now, we would like that to shape every aspect of their life, but we start with work because it's where people have the most repeated opportunities to do that kind of shaping.
I think that's great, Kevin. And I also like to tell people when we start a conversation about optimal work that really optimal work is about changing your relationship with challenge. That if we have any sort of dysfunction or challenge, and I always put dysfunction in quotation marks, right? If we're challenging with anything that's bringing us a special pain or suffering in our lives, it's because we have sort of inappropriate or incorrect relationship with challenge. And that we actually have an opportunity to shift that relationship, to go from a sort of reactive to a proactive relationship with that challenge.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the very thing that could bring out the worst in you can also bring out the best in you. So that challenge is, if people can experience in their life that sometimes they get triggered, they just get negatively triggered. And if you ask people, like, are there any things about your character, about your way of life that you would really like to change? Well, maybe they want to, stop avoiding things. Maybe they want to stop getting enraged. Maybe they want to stop complaining or dreading things. Whatever it might be, think, okay, well, what is then the most common trigger for this thing, for the vicious cycle that you're facing in your life? And it's called a vicious cycle because if something is hard and you avoid it, then the next time it's even harder. And if you keep avoiding, it gets harder and harder. That's why it's a vicious cycle. Well, the very trigger for the vicious cycle, whatever it might be, is if you can be crafting in advance how you want that to respond to that trigger, think of what would be the virtuous cycle I want to aim for. And so it might be that rather than responding with avoidance, I want to respond with curiosity or with openness or with like a greater sense of bravery, whatever it might be. And you think then concretely, what would that look like? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about then, changing your relationship to whatever challenges you. And instead of just feeling challenged and then somehow escaping the challenge, you end up embracing it, actively challenging yourself according to some kind of positive quality you want to grow in, some kind of skill you want to grow in, or some relationship you want to deepen. So that's the basic thing, the very thing that can bring out the worst in you. Whatever it is you're complaining about or dreading, that is precisely what then is the launching pad to bring out the best in you. And if you make changes in those triggers, in those challenges, the growth goes very deep. If you have a huge emotion that gets triggered, wonderful. Then the growth will go very deep.
Kevin, you remind me of someone that I was training. They were part of our sort of institutional engagements, and I was training them to then go on and coach and mentor others. And I asked them at the end of the training, I said, so how was all of this for you? And with characteristic sort of subtlety for this person. They said, well, all of the things that I used to dread, I'm now grateful for. And I just remember being kind of floored because they said it with such a matter of fact voice. But I think that's really kind of at the spirit of what we're trying to get to. And I remember thinking, I was like, that's exactly it, right? All of the things that you used to dread are now actually precisely the opportunities for your growth to become sort of the person you want to be able to love and serve others more effectively.
That's awesome. And you see that there's so much that is just nestled within the approach that we take here in Optimal Work of how to help people craft an hour of work, how to challenge themselves in that hour of work. But it has enormous downstream implications. It's just enormous.
Yeah, that's and I'm sorry to cut you off there, Kevin, but you reminded me of something. I remember the very first time I met you, you said something on this point that I found very striking, which was the brain is the organ that is most responsive to our behaviors. Right? And so the brain is the organ that is most responsive to our behavior change. And that's also something else I offer people when we start a conversation about optimal work. And so, I'll pause there and see if there's anything else you want to offer about that kind of sentiment or reflection.
Yeah, because I think that many times when you can find a way of growing, of challenging yourself, of building up some new way of acting, some skill, the amount of growth you experience is really a function of how frequently you get to practice it. So it could happen that a person is trying to overcome fear of speaking in public. And the difficulty with that is they might speak in public every 6 months or something. So it might not be something that happens often enough for them to feel like they're really getting traction with the new approach to public speaking. But if you can bring into how you approach setting up an hour of work, well, that is then very powerful because you repeat it so often. So anything that you continually are doing, if you can change how you do it, you get these extremely deep effects. And I think that you mentioned this thing is beautiful of people now say everything I was avoiding now I'm grateful for. Mm-hmm. Now, if you had simply aimed directly at gratitude, I'm not sure it would have worked. Just to say, well, just practice gratitude and all these things. That might not actually be operational enough. It might not be practical enough. But by using these steps of reframing, mindfulness, and setting an active challenge, and then going through those patterns and helping people to get better and better at applying that kind of rhythm for how they approach challenge, you end up getting really widespread effects. And you're just practicing it in an hour of work. That's the best part. It doesn't really take much more time. And you end up working faster, so you make up the time.
Right. No, that's exactly right, Kevin. And so you actually seamlessly led us into the next part of the conversation. I always like to start with the purpose of optimal work and offer some of these reflections. But the next thing that I like to discuss is sort of what is optimal work comprised of. So if we say, okay, optimal work, this is the purpose, well, then what are the component parts? And you already hit on two of the three in that last sentiment, which is optimal work is a theory of growth, and you mentioned them right there, the reframing, mindfulness, and setting a challenge. It's a method of growth, which is in that golden hour that we talk about, and we can talk about that a little bit more. And there's also the measure of growth. If we sort of look at the theory of growth, you had mentioned it, and I'll repeat it again for any new listeners, it's reframing, mindfulness, and challenge. Talk to us a little bit about why those are the three components of the theory of growth.
In a way, those are the three things that comprise all of cognitive behavioral therapy. And so cognitive behavioral therapy has three main elements. The cognitive part, which is changing how you think about something. The emotional part, which is changing how you feel things. And then the behavioral part, which is changing how you do things. So you have the way you're thinking about something, you have your attention, and and that's now taken up by mostly mindfulness-based approaches, teaching people mindfulness, teaching them how to stay in the present moment. Feeling is a great way of doing that. So it's all about your attitude, your attention, and your action. That does actually correspond to the very ancient way of thinking that humans have an intellect, memory, and will. And so we don't have to go into the deep philosophy of it, but but the idea is that those are essentially the three powers of the mind, that are being harnessed in that order when you're setting the stage to do any improvement in how you act, first think about what would the best look like. Have some kind of high hope for it. And then get your attention completely in the present moment so you can engage the first practical step. And then see that through step by step until the end as you carry out the challenge. So by getting people to get used to doing that, they end up doing each of their hours of work in a kind of new way, that they're thinking about how they can craft it. And so much of the time we live, in a kind of state of automation. And that tends to actually bring out the worst in us. You automatically give in to impulses, and then your thoughts just automatically hover on the negative, worrying about things, ruminating about things. So optimal work is actually a way to get out of automation. So you're not just getting started when you sit down to work and doing whatever feels automatic. No, you're pausing, raising your sights, being very attentional and deliberate in that moment so you can do it in a new way. And if you get some practice doing that deliberately, like as you say you do what we call a golden hour on the website, it ends up that you tend to do it more and more as the day goes on. And that is kind of like, there's something about peak practice. I don't know if you ever tried working on improving your voice, take singing lessons. What they have you do is 10 minutes a day of scales or exercises that you're doing. Now, as you do those exercises, it's not that all through the day you're going to be running scales out loud. That'd be kind of annoying for the people you live with. But what happens is, by doing 10 minutes of very focused practice, you just notice the rest of your day, your voice starts sounding richer. You're like, wow, it's easier to project. It's easier to articulate. Well, that's exactly what happens then with the golden hour. You do it intentionally sometimes, at least once a day is what we aim for. But then it just happens that you start not automatically, I should say in a bad sense of without thinking, it becomes more natural to be deliberate. You develop a habit of deliberately shaping what you do right before you do it. And that's where the gigantic progress comes in.
That's great, Kevin. I also use the example of trying to improve your fitness. So if you're trying to go get in better shape, get healthier, you don't go to the gym for 14 hours a day. You go to the gym for 1 hour a day, maybe 2 hours a day, if you're really motivated. And the idea is that by fitting in that intensity in that 1 or 2 hours, that local investment produces a global impact. So that's how
right.
and that's how I like to talk to people about the golden hour. I often tell them, in fact, that I'm not necessarily so concerned about their outcomes or what they get done, but rather it's a privileged time to practice the key parts of the theory of growth.
Yeah, and it's always good for people to think of what would be my best way of responding in this next task or in this next challenge. There's another thing that's very deep, which is that the challenge has to be coming from within, that they have to be kind of stretching themselves in this work in some way in order to grow in that way. It's like, it's not enough that you could have your muscles passively moved in some range of motion, right? That's not going to get growth. But if you can be, doing your own lifting deliberately, with the weights, even the weights don't have to be heavy, just enough for a stretch to occur. And then with the right motions, now you're building up new muscles. And so it's helpful for people to then use your analogy to approach a next hour of work like it's a gym. How can this give me a new kind of workout? And so maybe there are particular hard skills involved in how to do your job better. And you could be working at stretching yourself in how you do them. Or maybe there are soft skills involved in your job, and you can work on that, how to be stretching yourself and how to do that. There needs to be an intentional stretch in work for there to be growth in work. And that's kind of what Optimal Work is all designed to do, is to get people thinking about how they intentionally stretch themselves and embrace some higher ideal. But then when they go home, or not everyone's at home, but they go home and they realize that there's something in family life that is a little more challenging. Then he or she can start thinking, this is perfect. Now I'm going to stretch myself in this way, and they aim for it. So you end up having this positive, optimistic, youthful approach to challenge that constantly makes you new.
And what I think was really beautiful about that is even if we don't necessarily start from a position where we feel like we're aiming very high, that this approach still has plenty to offer us, even if we're, say, struggling with anxiety, struggling with distraction, or we feel like we're at a point in our lives where we just really feel stuck or we've lost meaning. So do you want to talk about how each part of the theory of growth perhaps answers kind of a common challenge we may be facing or an obstacle that we may be facing in life?
Yeah, there's a lot of richness, when you start looking at how to help people be more deliberate in shaping. And if you're talking about shaping your attitude, well, that has all to do with anything that you are just automatically viewing as a threat, learning how to practice, especially reframing, to flip that around and see it as an opportunity. And for people who suffer from anxiety, discovering reframing is like discovering a superpower. Because they can now deliberately, whenever they catch themselves with a sense of dread falling on them like a dark cloud, wait a second, what's the threat? How could this be an opportunity for me to grow? And then they set the challenge. So anxiety particularly responds to reframing, because reframing is flipping threats into opportunities. And anxiety is just what happens when you face a threat. And then you even learn that the adrenaline you get in facing the threat doesn't have to make your heart go fast and make you want to run away. It can actually make you perform better in positively approaching the challenge. So there's a special, I see anytime someone has anxiety, that is growth waiting to happen. And they can make giant progress just by learning the skill of reframing. When it comes to distractedness and distraction, it's a different kind of problem. And that's also about learning how to set up tasks before you do them. Essentially, how to reshape what pulls your attention. And instead of just leaving that haphazardly to whatever happens to cross your mind the next hour, by setting up the steps of the task in advance, you gradually train yourself to give those steps more of the magnetic pulling power for your attention. With the clear path then lined out in advance, it's much easier to experience flow. So flow means that you're challenging yourself, you're approaching it positively, and the steps are laid out enough that now you can just dive in. And that is really the opposite of attention deficit. Flow is the highest, most integrated approach to work. But it happens naturally when you practice our 3 steps of reframing it positively, bringing your attention to the present moment, especially to that first step of the task, and then challenging yourself all the way through it. So I see anxiety and distractedness as having really important, those are like pain points that I think, address, as well as I think that right now we know how they can be addressed. Another deeper one is just the sense of frustration or lack of meaning, the sense of being stuck on a plateau. So stuckness and meaninglessness and frustration, all of that, the answer to that ultimately is each person has to discover how his current circumstances actually do allow him to form higher ideals and deeper bonds. To how to bring into his life these higher ideals and deeper bonds. So I think we offer a very holistic approach to helping people through what are all the main challenges of people living and working in the world today.
Yeah, that's great, Kevin. So in the spirit of rounding out this sort of optimal work 101, we spoke about the purpose, and then we've gone through the theory of growth. We mentioned the method of growth, that golden hour. And then let's talk about that measure of growth. Let's talk about the inventory a little bit. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Let me ask you, Rashad, what was your first reaction when you first took the inventory?
Well, I remember taking this and saying, wow, that was holistic, and that there are plenty of opportunities for my growth. I remember thinking to myself, okay, one, I have to now think about what a 10 actually looks like, and two, I have plenty of opportunity in the most beautiful sense to grow.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that I had the benefit of mentoring you in those days and seeing the inventory and how you concretely used it to challenge yourself. And the nice thing with the inventory is you can set a goal and say, okay, I am going to take this item. Maybe there's something where you got a lower score relatively. I'm going to really address it with some practical resolution. And if you do that, you really can get a 10 on that item for the next week. I designed the inventory so that every question is tenable, in the sense you can get a 10. So, for instance, my workday is a series of high intensity sprints. How true is that? Well, maybe it wasn't really that true, but now you're going to say, I'm just going to make sure that I have an alternating pattern in my day of sprints and breaks. By the time you get to the next one, it could be a 10. Each of these is very doable to get a 10 out of 10, but no one has ever gotten a 10 on every item. So you can see that, but the more a score goes up in any one of those questions, so another very important one is I almost never complain. How true is that in the last week, 0 to 10? Turns out that's the item that tends to predict the overall score the first time people take the inventory. So whatever the score is on that, it tends to be, that's the average of all the points. So as you work on any one item, it actually gets easier to work on the others. And I hope that was your experience too, that you could see that these things all really fit together. And they're all pointing the exact same direction, but none of them is identical to the other. And in a sense, they don't really overlap entirely, but they give a very broad-based approach to growing.
Yeah. What I found most powerful about it was, again, the asking whoever's taking the inventory to stop and reflect and say, what does a 10 even look like? What does a 10 even look like in this particular area? And again, there are 24 questions. And what does a 10 look like here? How do you aspire to it? What are the tangible, practical things you can do to get closer to it? I thought that alone, I told this to people that I'm training and coaching. I said, even if I were just to disappear and all you did was take the inventory, that would have a benefit in and of itself. Because it is both diagnostic as well as a sort of a gentle coaching mechanism each week. And I think that's how you originally designed it.
I think that was what I was aiming for. I designed the inventory by looking at acceptance and commitment therapy. Mm-hmm. And there's something there, I won't go into detail, but Russ Harris and Steve Hayes have a lot of great books written on what is acceptance and commitment therapy and the different domains that are in it. And I was thinking through, like, how do I adapt this to work? And not treating problems, but providing progress and growth. And that's essentially how I originally came up with the inventory 10 years ago. And it's changed very little from that initial time. I wanted that a 10 is doable on every single, so I seldom give in to distractions in my work. Another really important question. But it's possible to get a 10. If you just set a perimeter before you start, turn off things, put the phone on, on do not disturb, and you do things, okay, it actually is very doable to if you really focus on it. That's what I wanted. But I also wanted people to be looking at these positive statements, which create in the person's mind a kind of positive vision of themselves. Because when you see the line, I almost never complain, what it does is it helps you to form an image in your mind of you almost never complaining. And then comparing where am I now in relation to that future version of me. And then it's like it helps the mind to lay out a path. That's what progress looks like. And every one of the questions does that. It just lays out, it lays a kind of scaffolding in the mind, of this is what will get filled out eventually. This is what growth looks like. And now we've had, thousands of people take it, and it's been, I think, proven. In the new masterclass we have in OptimalWork, one of the very cool things is just, not looking at, any particular person's results, but just looking as a whole, those who take the masterclass, we see the most impressive, steady progress in their inventory scores. And so, which is like, what you see when people are in mentoring. But as a whole now, the masterclass is actually beating the results I was getting mentoring Harvard students. So it's pretty cool that the masterclass is performing so well with people I don't know who they are, and we're not linking scores with names. But it's so I think the inventory is a very solid approach based on cognitive behavioral principles of what it looks like to have best practices and to get good at them.
Kevin, that sounds great. And we encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about any of this to really start with the masterclass. We designed the masterclass, as you alluded, to sort of replicate coaching and mentoring. And the idea is that individuals go through 20 days of focused content. There's about 20 minutes of sort of recorded content. That's a presentation, a best practice, and an exercise. And that's really meant to help people get the fundamentals in a very deep way about what optimal work is. But we hope that this sort of back to basics Optimal Work 101 has been helpful for everyone. And we look forward to speaking with all of you again. So Kevin, thanks for having me on the podcast a second time.
And Rashad, I look forward to having you on again. So I think we'll find a way to do this in a more regular way.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, take care.